Welcome, and thank you for letting these old stories keep you company tonight. This is The Sleeping Shogun, a quiet place where the long night is filled with the slow, gentle tales of old Japan. Tonight we travel to a village at the close of day, in a Japan that has almost entirely faded from memory, and we will stay there from the last red light of dusk until the pale gray of the coming dawn. Through the long hours of the dark, we will meet the quiet presences that the old country called yokai, not as things to fear, but as part of the landscape of the night itself. The rhythm of a stream, the flicker of a distant light, the soft weight of a shadow on an empty road. There is nothing here that will startle you, and nothing you are meant to remember. These are not stories to solve or to hold on to. They are only company for the dark, meant to be let go of as easily as they arrive. So settle in now, adjust your pillow, and let the weight of the day begin to leave your shoulders. Let your breathing slow to the quiet rhythm of the evening, and let your eyes grow heavy whenever they are ready. You do not need to follow every name or reach the end of the night. If you fall asleep long before the dawn arrives, that is exactly as it should be. Now, as the last light fades from the hills, let us begin. When the day loses its name. When the day loses its name, the world undergoes a quiet, almost imperceptible softening at its edges, a transition that the ancient people of Japan watched with a mixture of reverence and lingering caution. There is a particular half hour, just as the sun has slipped beneath the western hills, but before the true dark has established its domain, when the light becomes thin and gray, and the familiar shapes of trees, paths, and roadside stones begin to bleed into one another until they are no longer entirely themselves. In the old language, this hour was known as Omagatoki, a term that was traditionally believed to mean the hour of great misfortune, a time when the protective boundaries of the human village grew porous and allowed the vast, untamed wilderness to seep through the seams. It is said that it was later, during the long, peaceful years of the Edo period, that people began to write the name with different characters, turning it into the hour of meeting malevolent spirits, as if the culture had decided to populate the growing dimness with specific characters rather than leaving it as a vast, terrifying void. There is another, gentler word for this same threshold, tasogare, which grows from the simple, hesitant question asked by travelers peering through the gathering gloom. Ter so kare, or who is that who stands yonder? It is an expression born from the practical difficulty of recognizing a human face in the failing light, a linguistic monument to that brief interval when every silhouette encountered at a crossroads might be a neighbor returning from the fields, or might be something else entirely, waiting patiently for the night to begin. To walk through a village during this hour is to experience a strange suspension of certainty, where the dry rustle of a fallen leaf behind one's heel sounds less like the wind and more like a deliberate, tentative footstep following just a few paces behind. It is in these moments of soft uncertainty that one might encounter the Sodahiki-kozo, the sleeve-tugging child, a presence that leaves no footprints in the dust and offers no grand revelations, but merely exists as a sudden, gentle weight upon the hem of one's coat. For generations, in the small hamlets of the eastern provinces, travelers would report this sudden, slight resistance, a tug so faint it felt like the brush of a passing briar yet persistent enough to cause a person to halt and look over their shoulder. Upon turning, however, the road is invariably empty, the gray light revealing only the long, distorted shadow of a wayside stone or the crooked branch of an old pine reaching out into the lane. While later storytellers sometimes sought to burden this creature with tragic histories, the older and simpler traditions treat it merely as a manifestation of the twilight itself, a lonely, harmless presence, a collective personification of that instinct which tells us we are not entirely alone when the light dies. It functions not as an engine of terror, but rather as a quiet, physical reminder that the day is over and that the warmth of a hearth fire is waiting ahead. It is a gentle boundary marker in the dust, whispering to the solitary walker that it is time to quicken their pace and seek the safety of a latching door. Human beings have an old habit of turning their minor anxieties into companions, preferring a specific neighbor in the dark to the vast, indifferent silence of the hills. Further along the road where the path narrows and begins its steep climb into the forested passes, the air changes, growing thick with the damp, green scent of wild camellia trees and the heavy coolness of stone that has not seen the sun all afternoon. Here, where the trees weave a dense canopy that shuts out the last purple tints of the western sky, is the territory of the Aburasumashi. The name belongs to a creature deeply rooted in the steep valleys of Amakusa, an island district where the extraction of oil from camellia seeds was once a vital, painstaking labor of the mountain folk. The old accounts tell of an elderly woman walking through the lonely Kusazumi Pass with her grandchild, and as they passed a particular thicket, she remarked on the old tales, saying that in the past, an Aburasumashi was known to haunt these very stones. Before her voice had fully faded into the leaves, a low, dry voice replied from the depths of the brush, stating simply, "And even now, I am still here," before the silence closed back over the path like water. There is a dry, almost intellectual humor in this response, an old spirit refusing to be relegated to the past tense by a passing mortal, choosing instead to affirm its continuous, quiet residency with the briefest of corrections. The creature itself, when later artists tried to capture its likeness in ink, was imagined as a small, stoic figure wrapped in a rough straw cloak, its head flat and smooth like a river stone, completely devoid of the fierce expressions usually granted to things that dwell in the wild. It does not chase the traveler, nor does it demand tribute. It merely listens, acting as an ancient guardian of the mountain's resources, perhaps born from an old necessity to remind the islanders that oil, pressed drop by drop from the hard seeds of the camellia, was something to be used with care and reverence rather than wasted. In the twilight, the Aburasumashi represents the slow, enduring memory of the landscape, a reminder that the hills do not forget the generations of hands that have worked their soil, even if those hands have long since returned to the earth. Its presence is a voice that matches the texture of the dry leaves, an acoustic phenomenon that belongs exclusively to the hour when the birds have gone to sleep and the nocturnal insects have not yet begun their chorus. As the last trace of crimson drains from the furthest edge of the clouds, the small movements within the thickets begin to slow, and the path ahead loses the last of its definition, dissolving completely into the general shadow of the mountain. The slight weight upon the sleeve relaxes, dissolving back into the evening mist, and the dry voice within the camellia trees retreats into the deep, unmeasured silence of the stones. The threshold has been crossed. The names of the fields and the markers of the roads have all vanished into the uniform blue of the early night. There is nothing left to see along the lane, only the quiet settling of the dew upon the moss and the slow, heavy breathing of the ancient trees as they accept the dark. The smoke that only the idle can see. The smoke that only the idle can see begins its slow, blue ascent at that precise moment when the village fires are lit, and the last trace of the daylight has been drawn down behind the dark rim of the western hills. It is an hour of transition, a quiet breathing space between the work of the fields and the deep isolation of the night, when the air grows heavy with the familiar, seasonal scents of burning pine needles, dried leaves, and the sharp, clean bitterness of smoldering mugwort used to clear the evening air of insects. To those who walk along the narrowing lanes of the village with their minds still fixed upon the small tasks of the morrow, the smoke is merely a gray veil rising from the chimneys, a common necessity of the hearth. But to the person who has finished their labor, who stands at their timber gate with empty hands and allows their eyes to wander without purpose through the rising mist, the air sometimes reveals a different order of architecture. It is said that it was during the long, peaceful years of the Edo period that people began to write the name with different characters, and it was the 18th century artist Toriyama Sekien who gave a name and a permanent visual line to this phenomenon, calling it Enenra, the smoke that mimics the texture of thin silk, a creature that gathers its loose, translucent features from the shifting currents of the evening wind. Sekien recorded that this delicate entity does not reveal itself to the busy or the anxious, but belongs exclusively to those who possess a rare, quiet luxury within their own minds. The ability to look upon the world with an idle, unclouded gaze, discovering a human countenance in the pale, rising whirls before they break against the branches and dissolve into the uniform blue of the early sky. There is an old and gentle truth in this small invention, a recognition that certain things in the landscape require a suspension of purpose before they can be seen at all, and that the modern habit of looking only for landmarks often leaves the most delicate structures unnoticed. The Enenra is not a remnant of the old gods, nor is it a shadow born from ancient fear. It is, rather, a product of the city's later imagination, an appreciation for the temporary art of the household fire, where a face might appear for the length of a single breath, smile through its gray teeth, and then vanish into the twilight as the charcoal turns to ash. It is an entity that matches the state of a person drifting toward sleep, where the rigid categories of the daytime mind begin to soften, and the thoughts themselves become like those pale threads of smoke, rising without effort and changing their shapes according to the slow, cool currents of the room. As the village fires begin to die, turning to silent pockets of red wood gold in the darkness, the path leaves the cleared fields behind and plunges into the ancient, unmeasured shadow of the mountain forests. Here, the air loses the domestic smell of the hearth and takes on the cold, deep scent of damp cedar, old earth, and wet moss that has accumulated over centuries. In this older world, far beyond the reach of the city's inkstone and the artist's brush, the quiet that fills the spaces between the trunks is governed by Kodama, the ancient spirits of the trees. Unlike the smoke of the chimneys, which belongs to the fleeting decades of human settlements, these entities are recorded in the very oldest fragments of the nation's memory, appearing in the early chronicles of the Kojiki and the songs of the Manyoshu as the foundational life force of the wilderness. For thousands of years, the mountain folk have known that certain grand trees, those whose trunks have grown too wide for 3 men to span, and whose bark has turned gray and rough like the skin of an old creature, are not merely timber, but the physical dwellings of an enduring consciousness. In the isolated islands of the south, such as Aogashima and Hachijojima, the people still maintain small shrines at the roots of these ancient cedars, offering a quiet prayer before any iron is brought near the grove, knowing that to wound such a tree is to invite a long, silent grief into the valley. When a traveler shouts into a deep ravine during the quiet hours of the evening, the voice that returns to them from the opposite cliff is not considered an echo in the modern sense, but the polite, immediate response of the Kodama itself, repeating the human words as if to remind the intruder that the silence of the forest is inhabited. In later centuries, the tradition softened, and by the time the old artists drew these tree spirits, they were sometimes represented as an elderly man and woman standing together beneath a branch, their bodies half merged with the rough cedar bark, symbolizing an eternal, quiet fidelity that outlasts the brief lifespans of the valley below. In our own time, other storytellers have given these entities the shapes of small, pale forest dwellers with tilting heads, a modern reinterpretation that has carried their name across the seas. Yet beneath these later layers of white ink, the older reality remains unchanged. The Kodama is the heavy, breathing presence of the woods at night, the sound of a great trunk creaking under the weight of its own centuries as the evening wind passes through the high canopy. It is an acoustic presence that absorbs the sharp noises of the human world, turning the anxious cries of the lost into a soft, rhythmic rustling of 10,000 leaves, a vast green lullaby that smooths the rough edges of the night and carries the valley down into a deep, unshakable rest. As the evening deepens into the first true hour of the night, the gray features of the Enenra lift from the last embers of the garden fires, stretching their long silk sleeves toward the stars until they are entirely spent, leaving behind only the clean, faint scent of cold ash upon the grass. In the forest, the great trees draw the darkness into their deep rings, their long roots holding fast to the stone as the wind drops to a whisper. The natural world has assumed its watch, and the long, slow rhythm of the leaves has replaced the small movements of the village, turning the dark into a single, unmoving sanctuary, where the tired mind may safely drop its lantern and close its eyes. Sounds by the water. Sounds by the water grow distinct as the evening deepens. For when the visual world surrenders its clarity to the dark, the human ear inherits the landscape, translating the invisible movements of the night into a steady, rhythmic grammar of ripples and currents. There is a certain slow, deliberate frequency to water moving through a rural valley, a sound that has survived unchanged from the centuries before the first stone bridges were laid, acting as a natural clock that measures the passing of the hours by the constant, cool friction of the stream against the muddy banks. In the quiet hamlets where the houses stand back from the river's edge, The inhabitants who lie awake beneath their heavy quilts do not hear the water as an indifferent force of nature, but rather as an acoustic tapestry that fills the empty spaces between the mountain and the hearth. It is within this auditory domain, where the liquid murmur of the creek dominates the silence, that one encounters the small, persistent rhythm known as Azukiarai, the bean washer, an entity whose entire existence is captured in a single, repeating friction, the sound of small seeds being gathered and rubbed together in a bamboo colander over the running stream. For centuries, across the length of the main island and down into the southern provinces, villagers passing near the lonely mountain brooks or the stone supports of remote bridges would report hearing this peculiar cadence. Shoki, shoki, Sarah, Sarah, a dry, gentle scraping that sounded remarkably like someone preparing the red beans for a festival day. Local traditions, recorded in various regional accounts, often attached a rhythmic, menacing chant to this sound. A song that asked whether the unseen washer should clean its beans, or perhaps take a human traveler to consume instead. Yet, when one examines these old warnings with a distant and patient perspective, they seem to have functioned as an affectionate, protective fiction invented by generations of parents who sought to keep their small children away from the treacherous, slippery rocks of the river at dusk, using the thread of a hungry spirit to ensure the young remained within the safe illumination of the village lamps. In reality, the sound itself offers no violence. It remains a harmless, solitary rhythm of the water's edge, a personification of the river's own small agitations, where the steady friction of gravel shifting in the current creates a natural lullaby. It is a sound that matches the breath of a resting person, a predictable, soothing pattern that clears the mind of its daytime clutter by giving the ears a single, unchanging point of focus, washing away the lingering anxieties of the waking world, like silt carried down to the sea. While the bean washer governs the steady, horizontal music of the streams, the vertical descent of the night rain brings forth a different, lighter companion to the local lanes. When the sky turns a uniform, heavy gray and the steady drops begin to patter against the thatched roofs, a small, solitary light can sometimes be seen bobbing along the narrow ridges between the rice fields. This is the territory of the Amefuri-kozo, the rainfall boy, a diminutive entity who wears a wide, woven straw umbrella upon his head and carries a paper lantern through the downpour, appearing not as an omen of destruction, but as a creature who finds a pure, unclouded joy in the wetness of the night. Unlike the ancient spirits that inhabit the deep mountains, this cheerful child has no deep roots in prehistoric mythology. He is a creature whose lineage can be traced directly to the busy print shops of Edo, where Toriyama Sekian drew him as the youthful servant of the ancient Chinese rain god, transforming a grand, remote cosmic power into a modest, endearing character, suited to the domestic imagination of the townspeople. The old drawings preserve him as an innocent, unbothered presence, completely dry beneath his immense canopy, while the rest of the landscape is thoroughly drenched, his small lantern casting a warm, amber circle upon the puddles as he splashes through the mud. In the cultural vocabulary of the old provinces, rain was seldom viewed merely as an inconvenience to travelers. It was welcomed as a necessary blessing from the heavens, a life-giving moisture that filled the paddies and ensured the survival of the coming harvest. The Amefuri-kozo embodies this gentle relationship with the elements, serving as a reminder that the storm is not an enemy, but a vital, companionable rhythm that nurtures the earth while human beings rest secure within their timber walls. To watch his light from a distance is to feel the profound peace of being enclosed by the weather, where the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the leaves forms a protective barrier around the house, isolating the bedroom from the vastness of the outer world. As the midnight hour approaches, the steady rainfall begins to slacken, its heavy, percussive cadence softening into a faint, silver mist that hangs motionless over the fields. The small, amber glow of the boy's lantern moves further along the embankment, growing smaller and dimmer with each passing moment until it merges completely with the general dampness of the dark. Down in the rocky bed of the creek, the dry scraping of the colander loses its distinctness, its shoki rhythm sinking into the broader, deeper murmur of the swelling river as the water moves smoothly through the valley. The voices of the water have finished their long, evening recitative, leaving behind only a wide, undifferentiated hum that fills the dark space beneath the hills. A continuous vibration that grows more distant and more uniform until it becomes identical to the silence itself. The water remembers her. The water remembers her, even when the surface of the river has gone completely flat under the cold moonlight, and the human world has withdrawn behind its sliding screens. As the hours of the evening begin to surrender to the deeper stillness of the night, the focus of the landscape shifts away from the domestic safety of the village toward the unmonitored edges of the world. The limestone caves where the mountain water pools before its descent, and the treacherous, wave-beaten rocks of the seacoast where the tide leaves its white salt upon the stone. It is within these liminal spaces, where the liquid element meets the hard bone of the earth, that the old provincial accounts placed the Nure-onna, the soaked woman, describing her as a presence with the countenance of a beautiful human female and the long, massive coil of a serpent's body. In the older, coastal oral traditions of the western provinces, she was often spoken of as a creature of immense and heavy terror, an entity that would appear at the water's edge holding a small, weeping infant, enticing passing travelers to relieve her of the burden. Some tellings speak of something far more frightening still, of a heavier presence known as the Ushi-oni waiting in the deep. But such fears belong to the old fishing nights, and they need not follow us into the quiet room. Yet, when one looks beyond the layered anxieties of those medieval fishing hamlets, the creature dissolves into something far closer to the natural architecture of the shore itself. She is the ancient personification of the sea's own internal weight, the heavy, irresistible pull of the tide as it shifts against the sand, and the rhythmic, undulating motion of the long kelp beds swaying under the glass-green swells. Her dark, unending hair is the long, fine river grass that drifts in the current, brushing against the legs of horses as they cross the ford. A tactile reminder that the water has a texture and a memory of its own. To view her through this distant lens is to strip away the old panic of the dark and recognize her as a solitary spirit of the estuary, an expression of that fundamental coolness which returns to the rivers once the heat of the noon has been spent. As the path turns away from the wet sand and climbs toward the vast, silent flatlands that lie between the mountains and the sea, The darkness ceases to be a uniform void and begins to generate its own internal illumination. Across the wide, harvested rice fields and along the ancient stone foundations of lonely shrines, small, bluish fires can be seen hovering above the damp grass, appearing and disappearing in long, rhythmic sequences, like a line of lanterns carried by an unseen procession. These are the Kitsunebi, the fox fires, a phenomenon that has occupied the nation's literary imagination since the compilation of the early dietary records of the Honcho Shogun. For generations, the country folk did not view these cold, temperatureless flames with immediate dread. Instead, the inhabitants of the great Musashi Plain would gather on the final night of the year to watch the gathering of the lights near the roots of an ancient tree, measuring the number and the clarity of the fires to predict the abundance of the coming autumn's grain. The old printmaker Utagawa Hiroshige preserved this quiet relationship in his famous landscape series, depicting the countless ghostly fires as a delicate, decorative element of the night, an organic part of the winter scenery that lent a quiet, sacred beauty to the dark fields. A later age, seeking to maintain this memory in the pavement of the modern city, revived these legendary gatherings through a formalized winter procession at the Oji Inari Shrine. Though such contemporary events are reconstructions of a literary past rather than an unbroken survival of the old agrarian world. The fires themselves belong strictly to the night as it was once understood, a time when the wild creatures and the land were allowed their own quiet rituals apart from the hand of man. The Kitsunebi offer no heat. They are merely a soft, visual cadence that decorates the dark, a gentle arrangement of sapphire lights that blink along the horizon like stars that have descended to rest upon the stubble of the reeds. To watch them from the window of a dark room is to allow the eyes to rest upon a landscape that requires nothing from the observer, where the cold, rhythmic blinking of the blue fire functions as a natural nightlight, soothing the tired senses by its very distance and its absolute indifference to the affairs of the waking day. The blue illumination along the embankments begins to fade as the air grows colder, each small flame winking out in its turn until the wide floor of the valley is returned to the custody of the shadow. Down at the edge of the sea, the long, dark hair of the water spirit is drawn back into the deep by the receding tide, her silver coils slipping beneath the dark surface without leaving a single trace of foam upon the rocks. The wide fields are empty now, and the small lights that mark the boundaries of the paddies have all gone out, leaving only the smell of cold earth and the long, slow exhalation of the marshes as the night settles into its deepest, most unmoving hour. The hour when the walls appear, arrives with a profound, almost weightless silence, a midnight interval when the last domestic noises of the valley have died away, and the mountain paths are left entirely to the dark. To walk a remote lane at this hour is to feel the night grow thick and structural, as if the darkness itself were settling into permanent, solid shapes along the edge of the woods. For generations, travelers moving through the coastal passes of the southern provinces or the deep valleys of Chikuzen would report a sudden, baffling alteration in the nature of the road. Without warning, upon a path they had trodden 100 times by day, their forward progress would come to an absolute, unyielding halt against a barrier that possessed no visible outline and left no shadow under the moon. This invisible obstruction was known in the regional oral traditions as the Nurikabe, a presence recorded in later 20th century anthologies by folk chroniclers who gathered the vanishing memories of the countryside. The local accounts noted that no matter how far a person sought to flank this unseen surface, it seemed to extend indefinitely into the brush, mirroring their movements with an imitation of perfect, seamless stone. While earlier eras sometimes associated this invisible boundary with the minor illusions of forest animals, a later and more personal interpretation emerged from those who had experienced the ultimate isolation of the dark. Scholars have noted how later writers, drawing upon their own memories of profound sensory deprivation in the silent wilderness of foreign campaigns, found in this old regional name a perfect vocabulary for that moment when human exhaustion turns the empty air into a physical weight. Yet within the quiet economy of the old tales, the Nurikabe functions not as an instrument of malice, but as a silent, structural protection. It is said that if a traveler ceases their frantic beating against the air, lays aside their staff and simply sits down at the base of the invisible masonry to smoke a pipe or draw a quiet breath, the density of the night gradually relaxes. The phantom plaster dissolves back into the mountain mist, and the path opens cleanly once more. The barrier seems to have functioned as a necessary, wordless intervention, a protective wall that stands before the weary walker to whisper that they have hurried too far into the dark, and that it is time, if only for the length of a single charcoal ember, to rest. Human beings have always kept a cautious tally of the things that follow them, forgetting that in a world without lamps, a shadow behind one's shoulder is often the only proof of one's own movement. Further along the high ridges, where the gravel slides underfoot and the wind from the gorge smells of wet granite and cold pine, a different rhythm joins the solitary traveler. This is the Okuri-inu, the companion beast that takes up its position a dozen paces behind, matching its four-furred feet perfectly to the cadence of the human stride. The mountain folk across the central ranges maintained a meticulous code regarding this unseen escort. So long as a person walked with a steady heart and kept their eyes fixed on the lane ahead, the beast remained an absolute, impenetrable shield against the more predatory terrors that waited in the deep ravines. The old accounts warned that if one were to stumble and fall headlong into the dust, the guardian would instantly transform into a consumer. Yet the remedy remained beautifully simple, requiring only that the fallen traveler sit upright, dust their knees, and say aloud, "This is a weary road," to turn the danger back into a patient, watchful silence. Upon reaching the safety of the final stile, where the first thatched roofs of the next village appear under the stars, the traditional custom was to wash one's feet and leave a single straw sandal or a portion of red rice at the boundary, offering a brief word of gratitude to the dark before the latch was thrown. In the context of a long journey, the Okuri-inu reveals itself not as an engine of panic, but as a loyal, externalized discipline. It is an assurance that even when the path is entirely lost to the shadow, there is a presence that will not allow the traveler to dissolve into the void, a guardian that catches every hesitation and ensures that every step, no matter how heavy, is escorted safely toward the dream's edge. The heavy, rhythmic stepping within the brush grows faint as the lane descends into the valley floor, the four-footed cadence separating itself from the human heel until it is nothing more than the dry click of a pebble settling in the distance. At the crossroads, the invisible masonry of the ridge has turned back into the general fluidity of the gray mist, leaving the way ahead completely clear under the wide, unmoving vault of the night. The long protection of the road is concluded, leaving only the deep, cool peace of an open threshold, where the world has ceased its demands, and the darkness stands open like a sanctuary, waiting for the traveler to step through and leave the path behind. The deepest part of the night. The deepest part of the night arrives during the first half of the hour of the ox, a midnight interval when the yin energy is traditionally believed to reach its absolute zenith, and the boundary separating the living world from the hidden realm of the dead grows perfectly transparent. In the vocabulary of the old cosmologists, this was the moment when the gate of the demon quarter, set in the damp northeast brush of the landscape, stood open to allow the quiet circulation of ancient presences. Yet, within the domestic geography of the bedchamber, this deepest dark brings no sharp terror. Instead, it installs a supreme, heavy silence that functions as a sanctuary for the tired body. It is within this unmoving atmosphere, where the only sound is the slow, seasonal contraction of the house's cedar beams, that one might find the Makuragaeshi, the pillow turner, an entity whose entire industry is spent upon the subtle alignment of the sleeping head. In the older, rural oral traditions of the northern provinces, this small traveler was sometimes associated with the restless shades of ancient guests or the playful tricks of a dwelling's guardian child. Older generations viewed its work with a lingering caution, believing that to have one's pillow shifted was to have the soul's path into the dream world disrupted, or to risk the balance of one's vital breath. However, when one sets aside the layered anxieties of those old, dark houses, the creature reveals a far gentler purpose within the economy of rest. It operates not as a thief of life, but as a silent, invisible adjuster of the body's posture, a presence that slips into the room on slipperless feet to nudge the heavy down or the stuffed rice chaff into a position that matches the true inclination of the neck. It is a personification of the body's own natural intelligence, that wordless instinct which causes a sleeping person to turn and settle until their face is directed toward the most propitious quarter of the room. Every small midnight adjustment of the quilt is its work, a quiet choreography designed to ensure that the spirit is pillowed softly against the hard edges of the waking world, cradled in a symmetry that allows the heart to drop its burdens and slide effortlessly into the deepest, most restoring registers of sleep, while the small adjuster of the bedding moves in absolute secrecy. A different and more atmospheric guardian stands, watch over the final termination of the evening's words. In the old days, when groups gathered to pass the dark hours by telling 100 separate tales of the uncanny, a single lantern containing 100 wicks was placed behind a screen of blue paper, casting a cold, watery tint across the tatami mats. As each narrative concluded, the teller would extinguish one flame, causing the room to sink by slow degrees into the cold custody of the night. It was believed that upon the extinction of the final wick, a spectral female presence known as the Aoandon, the Blue Lantern, would emerge from the final pocket of smoke. This figure has no deep lineage in ancient prehistoric mythology. She is a product of the 18th century urban imagination, a visual character recorded by the same Edo artist, Sekian, to give a specific face to that sudden, collective indrawing of breath that occurs when a room goes completely dark. Yet, the old accounts contain an odd and comforting paradox. Because the gatherers knew that the 100th tale would summon the presence, they invariably halted their talk at the 99-shu whisper, leaving the final wick burning as they parted to seek their beds. In the long telling of this night, she serves as a kind of gentle usher, a presence that stands near the door to suggest that the hour of narrative has reached its natural capacity and that it is time to lay aside the voice. She does not bring violence. She merely represents that clean, necessary darkness which must follow the ending of every story, a cool, sapphire peace that smothers the last glowing ember of daytime thought and invites the listener to surrender the last line of consciousness to the vast, uncomplicated blackness of the night. The blue tint upon the paper screen undergoes a final, weightless dimming as the wick consumes its remaining oil, the long shadows of the room broadening until they are identical to the general dark. At the head of the bed, the small, invisible hands relax their grip upon the fabric, their work of alignment finished as the sleeper's breath falls into a slow, unbroken rhythm. The world of words and definitions has been cleanly closed, and the final blue flame has dissolved into the uniform quiet of the room, leaving behind only the deep, cool velvet of an unlit space where the mind is permitted to rest without shape and without memory. The fire that passes. The fire that passes marks the concluding movement of the hour of the ox, a quiet transition when the absolute stillness of the midnight begins to shift toward the first, remote coldness of the coming dawn. To sit in an unlit room at this hour is to realize that the deep dark is rarely entirely vacant, but rather moves with its own internal heat, carrying specific, luminous phenomena along the deserted channels of the old world. For generations, within the narrow, timber-lined alleyways of the ancient capital and upon the steep, stone-strewn slopes of the outer passes, travelers and night watchmen would report a heavy, percussive vibration that seemed to rise directly from the earth itself. A low, rhythmic go-ro that heralded the approach of a solitary, self-contained ignition. This was the Wanyudo, the wheeled monk, an entity whose appearance was preserved in the 18th century anthologies of the urban print shops, where Sekian fixed its likeness as a massive wooden carriage wheel completely engulfed in brilliant, temperatureless flames, centered upon the grim, weathered countenance of an old ascetic. The old records indicate that this fiery vision was not an entirely new creation of the Edo townspeople, but a later reshaping of an older tale, set down in early Edo collections, such as the Shokoku Hyakumonogatari, where a flaming, single-wheeled cart, the Katawaguruma, was said to haunt the night streets of Kyoto. Some tellings placed a grim face at its hub, others a solitary, sorrowful woman. And when the later artist gave the wheel the weathered countenance of a monk, the phenomenon drifted free of any single human story, becoming instead a pure, elemental force of the midnight grid. The old traditions maintained a practical, protective strategy against this passing light, advising the inhabitants of the city to remain behind closed shutters and paste a small paper amulet containing a Confucian adage above their lintels, a reminder that, in an age before street lamps, the most effective defense against the mysteries of the road was simply to look away, granting the night its own unmonitored freedom. Human beings have an old habit of assuming that every fire in the dark is an enemy, forgetting that a flame that moves in a straight line is merely seeking its own destination. The Wanyudo does not linger at the threshold, nor does it seek to break through the cedar lattices of the houses. It remains strictly a creature of passage, moving through the lanes with the steady, predictable momentum of a riverboat carried by a swift current. Over this brief interval of the dark, the passing light reveals its true and comforting nature, acting as a deep, tactile source of comfort for the resting mind. To watch its progress from behind a closed screen is to experience the healing weight of a moving hearth, a sensory process where the rhythmic, heavy turning of the wooden wheel and the soft, roaring murmur of the flames function as a visual lullaby. The listener's attention is drawn to the steady, retreating cadence of the wood against the stones, a pattern that matches the slow, regular pulse of a body sinking into the deepest registers of rest, allowing the warmth of the phantom axle to dissolve the last, lingering chills of the waking mind. The brilliant, golden reflection that illuminated the paper panels begins its smooth, inevitable withdrawal as the carriage moves further down the stone path, the long shadows of the eaves returning to their proper places in the dark. At the crossroads, the low, percussive vibration dissolves completely into the broader hum of the sleeping valley, its heat lifting from the cobblestones like morning mist. The fire has passed, leaving behind no scar upon the wood and no charcoal in the dust, but only a deep, consolidated quietness that settles over the ancient city, a perfect stillness that marks the final expiration of the midnight hours. Before the sun remembers. Before the sun remembers, the world slips into a final, weightless interval of blue and violet, a long, cool dawn where the heavy shadows of the night begin to lose their density without yet surrendering to the brightness of the morning. It is an hour known in the classical vocabulary as shinonome, a word that originally grew from the woven bamboo windows of the old houses through which the first pale glimmer of the sky would pass, long before the daily round of life had resumed its noise. In this transition between the deep registers of sleep and the first movements of the waking mind, the landscape is cleared of its dark architecture. It is within this cool, expanding light that one might encounter the Baku, the Dream Eater, a composite entity of ancient lineage that has watched over the bedding of the nation for centuries. Originally carried across the sea from the older continental texts as a sacred guardian against disease and malevolent forces, the character underwent a quiet translation within the local household, turning its long elephantine snout and its heavy, iron-like joints toward a more specific domestic labor, the collection and consumption of human nightmares. The old records indicate that by the years of the Edo period, this guardian had become a standard fixture of the night's end, its image carved into the cedar pillars beneath the eaves of grand halls, like those at Nikko, to symbolize a peace so absolute that even the weapons of war had turned to dust. For the ordinary townspeople, the custom was simpler. requiring only that the name of the beast be written upon a drawing of a treasure ship placed beneath the pillow on the first evenings of the year. A graphic assurance that any dark or unsettling vision generated by the sleeping mind would be immediately intercepted. Seen from behind a closed screen, the creature is no bringer of strange portents, but a silent, benevolent filter of the mind's residual anxieties. It operates as a gentle custodian of the spirit's recovery, stepping softly between the quilts to draw the cold, jagged fragments of daytime stress from the sleeper's brow, turning the heaviest dreams into a pale, weightless mist that is easily scattered by the dawn. It is a presence that functions as a natural purifier, leaving the inner landscape clean and unburdened, so that the transition into light is felt only as a smooth, uninterrupted continuation of peace, while the guardian of the pillows completes its quiet filtration. The final, cold element of the winter landscape prepares its departure from the human lane. Across the deep valleys of the northern ranges and along the old, lonely ferry crossings where the water runs slow under the mist, the early light catches the pale, drifting contour of the Yuki-onna, the snow woman. For generations, the rural oral traditions maintained a severe and unyielding portrait of this spirit, describing her as a freezing wind given the form of a beautiful, unblinking female who would steal the breath of travelers caught in the mountain drifts. Yet, a later and gentler age provided a different interpretation of her nature. The 19th century writer, Lafcadio Hearn, set down an older local narrative from the western Tama district, transforming the cold specter into a figure of deep, temporary devotion. A woman named Yuki, who lived for years among men, raising children and sharing the warmth of a mortal hearth until a broken promise forced her to dissolve back into the white weather from which she came. By placing these two distinct portraits side by side, an older telling of the nature's absolute cold and a later literary one of human affection, the history of the spirit reveals a profound therapeutic purpose for the tired senses. She represents that final, necessary process of cooling which allows the mind to achieve absolute stillness, an internal winter that temporarily freezes the hot, frantic agitations of the waking day. Her presence brings no injury. She is the personification of that clean, silver silence that follows the storm, a quiet element that locks away the small griefs of the valley within a beautiful, unmoving ice. And as the first true beam of the morning sun touches the highest ridge of the mountain, her long, white sleeves begin to lose their definition, turning slowly back into the early mist that lifts from the pine needles and floats harmlessly toward the early sky. The silver line along the eastern horizon broadens into a pale, golden warmth, the ancient trees drawing the light back into their bark as the wild creatures return to their hidden dwellings within the wood. The long procession of the night's shapes has reached its quiet conclusion, each entity having completed its small watch and retired smoothly behind the closing borders of the day. The journey through the hours is completed, leaving the room entirely secure within the return of the world's familiar design, where the air is perfectly still and the mind, fully rested and fully guarded, may safely let go of the last thread of the narrative and slip into the deep, unmeasured quiet of the sun's return. If these quiet hours have carried you gently toward sleep, then the night has done its work. Should you wish for more of these slow journeys, you are always welcome to follow the channel. so that the next long night finds its way to you. And if you are somehow still awake, you might drift toward the great storms at the edge of the old empire, or the age when these islands themselves were still being dreamed into being. But there is nothing left for you to do now. Adjust your quilt once more. Let your breathing settle into the slow rhythm of the morning, and rest easily and completely until the day is fully wide.